One of my favorite sayings is, we are a resurrection people. And when I say that, I mean that we are a people who live after the death of Jesus on the cross and after his resurrection from the dead. But there's so much more to that saying. Because being a resurrection people means that we are also a people who live with death and loss and suffering each and every day of our lives. And yet, in the midst of all of that, we are a people who trust in the power of God to bring new life, new beginnings, new hope, and new joy out of the sorrow. That's what we hear this week as we read Psalm 30. Weeping spends the night, but joy comes in the morning. And you, Lord, have turned my wailing into dancing. This week we meet two women, although not just women, but mothers of sons, and not just mothers, but widows. Now, it's important for us to know that they are widows because widows are particularly vulnerable. You see, in their society, a woman was provided for first by her father and then her husband. So if her husband died, a woman's best hope for a future would have been for her son to take care of her. And this is the circumstance in which we meet these two women. The first story is from 1 Kings 17. It tells us of a widow who was taken in the prophet Elijah, even though she only has enough to make one more loaf of bread for her and her son. And yet, through the power of God, her jar of meal and her jug of oil never run out. And our story picks up this week that after an unknown amount of time, this woman's son becomes ill. So ill, we are told, that he has no breath in him. Now what for this woman? And after an angry and somewhat sarcastic outburst at Elijah, questioning if he is truly a man of God, as he brought the wrath of God into her home, Elijah takes the son from the mother's arms, carries him up to his own room, and prays over him for his life to be restored. And the Lord listens to the voice of Elijah, and the woman's son is revived. And then in our gospel lesson in Luke, the second scene we read this week, Jesus happens by a funeral march with weeping and mourning, for a man has died. He was his mother's only son. And Jesus has compassion for her and says to her, "Do not weep." And the woman's wailing was turned to dancing. This week, remember, we are a resurrection people. Yes, death touches us all. Loss and pain and suffering comes to each of us in its own way. But God's love, Jesus' compassion, turns our wailing into dancing. Yes, weeping sometimes spends the night, but joy comes in the morning. I look forward to seeing you in worship.